always quote your attributes, stuff like that. That's good, and I feel that way, right? I think you should always quote your attributes, and you should definitely write lowercase elements, and definitely write lowercase attributes. But that's my personal preference, right? That doesn't need to be in the language itself. So in HTML5, any one of these is valid. If you've been using XHTML syntax up till now, right? Lowercase elements, lowercase attributes, always closing the self-closing elements, continue to do so, right? That's fine. Now, the downside is that now the validator becomes a less useful tool. I've been using the validator for 10 years, feeding it XHTML 1.0 documents, and it tells me whenever I forget to quote an attribute. It tells me if I leave off a closing paragraph tag, stuff like that. Now it's not going to tell me. Now it'll say, yep, this all looks fine to me. I can see how this would be a bad thing. However, I think what needs to change is the tools rather than the language. I think it's correct that the language allows this looseness. I think it's correct because of Postel's law, because of the robustness principle. And I think what we want are lint tools rather than validators. In the same way that JavaScript is a pretty flexible language, plays pretty loose and fast. There's 10 different ways of doing the same thing in JavaScript. But you have lint tools that enforce a particular coding style in JavaScript, right? There's jslint.org, and it will hurt your feelings. You put your JavaScript in there and says, no, I don't think this is the right way to do this, you should do it this way. It's actually a really useful tool, and I'd like to see the same tools for HTML. Up till now, we've been using the validator for that, and that's not actually what a validator is supposed to do. So this is kind of controversial, but this has to be this way essentially because of the design principle of supporting existing content. The web looks like this. The web has got a mix of styles. The web has got all sorts of syntax out there, and HTML5 has to support that. You can see how, when you're building something like HTML5, there's this balancing act. On the one hand, it's the most important format on the web, right? It is the lifeblood of the World Wide Web. It has to be the best specification it can possibly be. On the other hand, you have to balance it with supporting existing content, with being pragmatic, with working in browsers today. And if you go too far in one direction, if you go too far down the road of making a theoretically brilliant, best specification ever, you end up with XHTML2, where it just doesn't work, right? It's just impractical. But if you go too far down the other end, you end up with font tags and tables for layout, because being pragmatic, that's what most of the web is about, right? So somewhere in between, you've got to find that balancing act between making the language better, adding in new features, and supporting existing content. And it's all because of, once again, the robustness principle. It's something that keeps coming up again and again. And I think it highlights the fundamental difference between the way that XHTML2 was going and the way that HTML5 is going now. It kind of keeps coming back to John Postel's robustness principle. Here's another design principle from HTML5. Solve real problems. Okay? Seems kind of obvious, but there are plenty of specifications and working groups out there that are kind of solving theoretical problems that nobody actually has. This one is about real-world problems. Very simple example. Let's say I'm writing in HTML or XHTML, and I want to wrap this kind of box in a link. Well, you can't wrap the whole thing in a link, so I put the headline opening, and then I have the text inside the headline in a link, and then I have the paragraph opening, and I have the text inside the paragraph in a link. Well, in HTML5, what you can do is just wrap the whole thing in a link. Very handy. And this is solving a real problem because I've come across that pattern many times where I've wanted to make a whole sort of chunk of content clickable, and in order to be valid in previous versions of HTML, I have to do it the top way, and in HTML5, I can just do it this way. I just wrap the whole thing in a link element. Once again, this isn't some pie in the sky, ooh, wouldn't it be great if we could do this kind of idea. This works today. This works in browsers. It turns out it's always worked, it's just never been valid. So what HTML5 is doing here is just codifying what already happens. So it solves a real problem. Pave the cow. This is probably the most buzzwordy of the design principles, I think. Pave the cow. It does sound a bit like something you'd hear at a business meeting. But it's actually it's a pretty good principle, because essentially, when you're trying to decide what to do, what to fix, what to concentrate on, look at where the problems are happening today. Look at where people are struggling already. And you see this in architecture, right? I mean, there's examples where they build a college campus, and there's a college green in the middle, and rather than building the path that goes across the college green, they wait a semester. They see how students walk and where they trample down the grass to get from building A to building B to building C, and that's where they build the path, right? So it's the usage that drives the infrastructure. And that's happening in HTML5 as well. There's a bunch of new elements being introduced in HTML5, and the ideas behind them kind of map to stuff we'd already be familiar with, because we're already kind of doing this sort of thing in HTML anyway, using classes and using IDs, right? We probably all have, ID equals head or header, ID equals footer, names like this, side, sidebar, aside, okay? Nav, navigation. These are the things that are now getting codified into HTML5, because essentially they're paving the cow paths. These things already exist, but now they're becoming official. So we're talking about these new elements. So this is the way it's often talked about. Is that, let's say you've got an existing document like this where you're using IDs, like the ones I mentioned, the ID equals header, ID equals navigation, sidebar, blah, blah, blah. Then now you'll be able to get rid of your divs and use elements, right? You can use header, nav, aside, footer, okay? And that's true. This is exactly what you can do in HTML5, is replace a bunch of divs with a bunch of new elements. But that really is only part of the story. Okay, if that was all you could do now with these new elements, that wouldn't be that useful, just replacing a handful of divs with a handful of new elements. Instead of thinking of these elements as replacements for IDs, it makes more sense to think of them as replacements for classes. Because it's the fact that you can use multiple headers, multiple navs, multiple sides, multiple footers throughout a page that makes it really useful. And when you look at these new elements, they're not all equal. These four here, section, article, aside, and nav, they're different. They introduce a whole new content model in HTML. That's called sectioning content. These are all sectioning contents. And what that means is, anytime you open one of these elements up, you're effectively creating a miniature document, a miniature standalone section, a miniature standalone article that has its own outline, that can literally live by itself. So let's say you had a bit of markup, look something like this, okay? Something called, let's say, a node, just taking a crazy example. And let's say you got some classes like meta and content, right? Class equals, maybe got links at the end of your node, for example. Well, what you can do now with HTML5 is replace those with these new elements. The section instead of the div, right? You've got nav, class equals links. You've got header. Notice the footer is there, but the footer isn't at the bottom. And what's that about, right? Footers, they got to come at the bottom. No. A footer is about the content. Footer